Okay. Okay, so here we are with the Krishnacore podcast, first chapter. This day we are with a special guest with Sundarananda Das. So he's a disciple of Shilanaraya Maharaj. He has some years like into the Krishna consciousness, also playing in some bands. So now I will introduce you Mike Dines. He's an academic. He's writing a book about Krishnacore. So the idea of this podcast is to give to the people some culture about Krishnacore. What means Krishnacore? It's like we have some not so much idea about what it really means, how it's connected, the hardcore music, hardcore punk music with the Krishna core, with the Krishna culture, Krishna consciousness. So now uh, Mike Dines will speak a little bit, and we continue with the interview.
Thank you, Madhu.
Mike?
Sundarananda, could you just kind of introduce yourself? I know that you've kind of sent me a few bits and pieces about you being from New York, I do believe. But could you just introduce yourself and what you're up to now, etc., etc.?
Sure. Obviously, my name is Sundarananda Das. I'm a disciple of Bhaktivedanta Narayana Maharaj. Let's see, that kind of happened in a roundabout way. I actually started off walking into an ISKCON temple in about 1987. And at the time, obviously, I was just completely immersed in New York punk rock and hardcore scene. And that was kind of before we really saw a lot of the crossover of hardcore into the temple and vice versa. Right before, actually, I guess. So every band that I've been in, because it was such a huge part of my life, every band that I've been in, I've always tried to incorporate Krishna conscious lyrics, and that's worked out really well, because it seems, I mean, at least in the 80s and the early 90s, people weren't as adverse to hearing ideas that they didn't grow up with, or didn't come from some safe place, So that kind of, punk rock and hardcore was a great kind of a great outlet, to be able to express things and actually get feedback from people, and go back and forth. And so, like I said, I've always played music and always had bands, and even now my current band called Class Astronaut, still doing the same thing, incorporating Krishna conscious lyrics and just kind of trying to spread the good word.
For me personally, as well as being absolutely fascinated by this kind of crossover between Krishna consciousness and hardcore, is people's journey into Krishna consciousness. Sure. Could you give us a little bit more information? I didn't realize actually that you were 16 when you first went into a temple.
Yes, yeah.
I only know that because I just wished you happy birthday on Facebook.
Right.
And I'm the big this year as well. So you were born in 71, weren't you? So
71, yep.
Yeah, with the same age. So, and I know that you first introduction to it was by buying a book off an old lady. Was that right?
Yeah. What happened was, I used to have to take the subway to and from school every day. And one day there was a lady who, later I realized was a devotee from the Brooklyn Temple. She was mute, and she was selling books, and she had this kind of signboard that she had a couple of books on. And on the books it said, just books for $1. And I'm looking at them, and they looked kind of wild. One of them was called Easy Journey to Other Planets. And I was like, this is, I had no idea what this was. I was like, oh, sure. So I gave her a couple of bucks. I got a couple of books and stuff. And, I brought them home, and I wound up actually not even looking at them for a while. I just, kind of put them on the shelf and forgot about them. And one day I was reading a book about like the 60s and about George Harrison and the Beatles, and I saw a picture of George Harrison with this old Indian man. And I'm looking at this picture. I'm like, I recognize this guy. Why do I know who this guy is? I'm like, there's no way. And then it hit me. It's like, oh, that's the picture on the back of the book. And so I realized it was Prabhupada. And so that's what made me turn around and go read these books. And all of a sudden I started to have some insight into what this guy was singing about and what he was talking about. And back then, of course, the pre-internet addresses and phone numbers of the temples. So I called up the secretary of ISKCON, which was in California, just to order some more books. And I looked at it for the address of the closest temple, and there was the Brooklyn Temple, and I just decided I was going to go there and check it out that weekend. I had been kind of obsessed with different philosophies and different religious traditions and all, because I went to Catholic school as a kid, but that was only because of in the 70s, that was just the better school to go to in New York, and over public school. So my parents weren't particularly religious or anything like that. But I was just obsessed with different religions and reading about theosophy and this, that, and the other thing. And so I would go to visit some synagogue, or I'd go check out this mosque or this temple or this. So I just decided, okay, I'm going to go. And my friend and I went there, and it was just the craziest thing. I never felt so comfortable in my life. And it was weird to me because at that point in my life, I didn't even know. And New York is really segregated, kind of. There's Italian section, there's Black section, there's Jewish section. Everybody's kind of, people think of it as this kind of melting pot, but that's only half true. Everybody is kind of separated in most places, in most areas. So I never even knew any Indian people in my life. I'd never had Indian food in my life, and I walk into this place and it was the exact opposite of my experience in Catholic school. It was immediately friendly, sit down. Oh, you have a question? Sure, you can ask whatever question you want. No, none is going to hit you on the hand with a ruler if you ask a question. You can ask a million questions. It's actually welcomed. And then I'm getting up to leave, and they're like, hey, so you're going to come downstairs and eat? I'm like, eat? What do you mean? I'm like, that's what I'm smelling. And so I go downstairs and I eat prasadam for the first time. And I'm like, you guys do this every Sunday? And they're like, no, we do this every day. I'm like, I was like, all right, I'll see you tomorrow. And that kind of kicked it off,
Yeah, it's a great story. Madhu, did you want to ask the next question?
That's great. The thing is that if he has some religious background before, he was going to the church. I think he somehow explained something about it, but also he believed in God before to meet Hare Krishna devotees.
Sure.
It's also there is some background before, like Catholic Church,
and the thing is, I had Catholic school kind of left a bad taste, and because I would ask questions sometimes, and for example, one incident that sticks out, I remember asking a nun, we were in 7th or 8th grade, and she was telling us about Jesus is about to get arrested, and he tells all the apostles, he asks them, hey, do you all have swords? And they're like, what are you talking about? And he's insisting to them, like, look, you have to, if you have to sell your garments, you have to have swords. And so, I raised my hand. I'm like, what? Peace and love, turn the other cheek, Jesus. Why is he telling the apostles to buy swords? And I actually got in trouble for that. And like, call your parents. And she's telling them that I'm questioning the Bible. It's like, no, I'm not questioning the Bible. I'm asking you what it is that means. I'm asking you what it's saying. You're telling me one thing, and then you tell me this guy is telling them to buy weapons. I'm like, so just explain, that's all. But you're not supposed to ask those kind of questions. You just accept it and, be quiet and go to church, and that's it. So like I said, it was the opposite experience going to the temple, when all of a sudden it was like, oh, you have a question? Sure, is that it? Have any more questions? And one of the things that was encouraged, especially by my Gurudev, was, don't take my word for it. go and look and read this and then find out, and I being as obsessive as I was about various traditions and things like that, I would always look for historical or archaeological backup for certain stories and things like that, and that was discouraged in Catholic school also, because you're not going to find much archaeological or historical evidence for many of the personalities they're teaching you about in Catholic school. Whereas again, I had the opposite experience. Once I became a Vaishnava, once I stepped foot in the temple.
I think what you're saying, talking to devotees is it's very similar to what you're saying. And I didn't go to a Catholic school. I went to a Christian school. I suppose it was a Church of England school, and very much like you, I would
Sure.
sing hymns and etc. etc. But when it came down to the Hare Krishna movement and Krishna consciousness, there seemed to be kind of a whole package there. There seemed to be, it wasn't just about reading the Bible and then just taking it for face value. It was about kind of questioning it, and also there was a whole lifestyle with it, and a lifestyle that was about vegetarianism and the whole Vedas around this kind of philosophy. Can you just kind of a little bit more detailed? So there you are, you're 16 and you've walked into this kind of into the temple. You've been reading Journey to Other Planets, and those are the small little Prabhupada books, which are great. So how come you became a devotee? How come you became initiated, so to speak?
Okay, so obviously reading some of the smaller books like that, you're seeing that Prabhupada's quoting from Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, and also you graduate to the larger books, or the real Vedic texts, and one of the things that stuck with me was none of what I was reading or learning about was trying to tell me to, when I say change my life, I don't mean, there was some fine tuning, of course, like for example, that's when I, first stopped eating meat. And, since then I wound up becoming vegan, because to me, I have this whole thing about you can't really be a vegetarian unless you're vegan, particularly in Western countries. But all of the things that I was reading about were just kind of speaking directly to my regular life, and nothing. For example, one of the things in the Gita, you're being told you're instructed to learn what it is your duty is, and to perform that duty, not someone else's, or not to and that spoke to me, especially like during the skinhead days. Like that was like, oh yeah, well that's what you do, that's the goal, and and of course the meat eating thing made complete sense to me, and something I took up immediately. The whole the idea of becoming the best person that you can be, or the most fine-tuned version of yourself, not of someone else, not of taking on someone else's identity. Those things just completely made sense to me. And then the idea of, I didn't like the idea of what I call, false renunciation. You didn't, pretend to be this pious person doing this and doing this. There's no benefit to anyone in that, whether it be to God or yourself. There's no benefit in false renunciation. So, there's this whole idea of learning to use things in Krishna's service. I'm a great painter. I love painting. Do I give up painting because I want to sit in the temple and chant all day? No. Learn how to paint in a way that you can use it in Krishna's service. Do I give up? I'm a musician. I play music. That's my passion. That's what I love to do. Do I give that up so I can go and sit in the temple and chant on beads and give people flowers in the airport? No, you use that in Krishna's service. You can use everything around you and everything that you are to practice this whole philosophy. And like you said, it wasn't the idea of converting to this religion. The idea was, we were taught right away that Sanatana Dharma is an eternal function. It's not just this little set of practices or these rules. Okay, on this day, you read this book, and then you go to the temple and you say your prayers, and then then on Monday you go back to being an asshole, whatever. It wasn't like that. It was like you said, an entire whole life encompassing thing. And it's funny. Early on, like I'm seeing the shirt that you're wearing, Prabhu, one of the first people I noticed was John Joseph was one of the people serving food at the temple, and at the Brooklyn Temple. I remember seeing him, and then he turned around to someone else yelling, "Hey, Prabhu, go get that tape with the bhajans." I'm like, how is this like, in my mind, I'm like, this is like some CBGB's maniac. Like, how is he, fitting in here? And then, you realize right away that this person isn't changing his life. This person isn't pretending to be something that he's not. What he is fits in perfectly with this entire thing. And all of these practices go along well with the life philosophy he had already developed, and that kind of goes towards also, if I can ramble on for a second, you used to hear sometimes people saying like, oh, keep religion out of hardcore, especially in New York. That was a big thing. And there's a lot of like Boston and stuff like that too. There's a lot of keep religion out of hardcore. My whole thinking from the beginning was like, well, at least to my mind, the first hardcore bands that I was aware of in that area was like the Bad Brains and the Cro-Mags. I want somebody to go back in time to like 1981 or so and go tell the Bad Brains to keep religion out of hardcore. Like, I don't think that worked out so well. Or tell the Cro-Mags, you know what I mean? Because even with them, none of them were doing it in a way that was, preaching these ideas that were, like harmful to anyone. It's like, oh, I'm sorry. So you mean there's somebody singing a song about, not killing animals or not, taking drugs or not? One, why is that a bad thing? And two, that's been in hardcore since day one. So, I mean, it seemed weird at first that there were hardcore bands that weren't singing about religious topics,
Madhu, do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say that about the Christians, it's like how he was questioning the Christian religion. Like somehow it makes me reminds me something that Srila Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhanta says, is that Jagat Guru, like Jesus Christ is Jagat Guru, and some people take shelter in him, but it's completely okay. But actually, this Guru, it must be visible to us in a present Guru. That's why we had this Guru Parampara. Otherwise, who can teach us by the example what is the real way how to follow the Jagat Guru, in this case, Jesus Christ. And it was really nice that also you point out this fact that these people would say that keep the hardcore keep the religion out of hardcore. But you see, in the first steps of hardcore, it start with the Bad Brains and it start with the Agnostic Front. Also, let's say like the original vocalist of Agnostic Front is also devotee. Also, Tarun Krishna, who left the body 2 years ago. Tarun Krishna, he was playing with Agnostic Front with 12 years old.
Yeah, and
he's my god brother. Yeah, so it's really something so special. So such a thing like keep the religion out of hardcore it doesn't make much sense.
Right.
Now the thing is that the next question is you took shelter, you took initiation in my Param Gurudev, Bhaktivedanta Narayan Goswami Maharaj. And we see, and we used to speak with Mike sometimes, that most of the guys who come to Krishna consciousness because of the hardcore music, they usually get connected with ISKCON temples, ISKCON gurus. But you came to Srila Narayan Maharaj. What made him so special? Yeah, I know, but I want to know you.
Sure.
your realizations about it. Why not ISKCON and why Shilanarayan Maharaj?
Well, there's a couple of reasons, but just to go back to what you're saying about like Tarun, probably, first of all, he was fantastic. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think within hardcore, he's appreciated, but I mean, when you think about all the places that his guitar has touched, between Warzone, Agnostic Front, I mean, it's just, he was all over the place,
Yeah.
He was a good guy, now, and along those lines, when people say about, keeping religion out of hardcore, at that point, when someone says that, I think they're denying that hardcore is punk rock. Because, the first thing that attracted me to punk rock, even as a young kid, there's no, this isn't some kind of top 40, major label, like rules and restrictions. Like, no, the reason punk rock bands exist and lyricists exist is because I can, within this, I can say whatever it is I need to say. I can express whatever it is I need to express. I want to talk about whatever it is, whatever ideas I have, I can talk about, and there are no restrictions on that. And that's what makes punk rock different from, some of the lesser art forms, as I would say. I mean, you had, I learned so much about politics as a kid from like Crass and the Dead Kennedys. Things I wouldn't have been taught in school, and things I wouldn't have learned about, and things I certainly wasn't hearing about in top 40 radio songs. You know what I mean? I mean, Gigi Allen singing about feces. Punk rock, he can sing about whatever he wants. You know what I'm saying? That's allowed. So I mean, saying keep religion out of hardcore, like, wait a minute. So you're going to put rules and regulations on what you can and cannot, write lyrics about or sing about? Like, that's when it ceases to be punk rock at all. So you can no more say keep religion out of hardcore than you can say, I don't know, keep your political ideas out of hardcore, or keep your ideas about drugs and alcohol out of hardcore. It's like, at that point, it's like, okay, well, then go start a top 40 band and, sing nonsense lyrics about nothing that mean nothing to anyone, So fortunately, punk rock and hardcore, had the effect of making most of us pick up books. It's like you'd hear about some idea, you want to know more about it. So you go and you start reading about these different things, and a lot of punk rock and hardcore kind of sparked a lot of education in a lot of people, and and I think that's what makes it punk rock and hardcore. You can't all of a sudden say like, nope, only this, and this. Those are the topics. That's it. I mean, like say oi, so I got to sing about my boots and my pants. I'm going to sing about the shirts I wear of every song. Like, that's nonsense. That does nobody any good. You know what I mean?
That's really interesting. That's really interesting.
So, yeah. So, but as far as Gurudev goes, I was living in the Brooklyn Temple, and I was at the time kind of fishing around, seeing which guru I kind of wanted to seek initiation from, and I was kind of attached to a guru named Sridhar Maharaj in the Brooklyn Temple, not the old Sridhar Maharaj, but the American Sridhar Maharaj, different.
Yeah.
And he was fantastic. He was kind of just really just kind of gruff. He was like, we used to think of him as like skinhead guru, like, because he, we would have these programs and he was all about pizza prasadam. And I told him, hey, like, I'd like to set up like a wrestling tournament, like, Krishna and his brother were wrestlers and all, maybe we can set up like a devotee wrestling tournament. He goes, oh yeah, we can call it the Hari Bowl. And, you have, so he was great, but he actually passed away. He left his body. And during that time, it was kind of the mid 90s. And a friend of mine from the Brooklyn Temple, he said, hey, have you ever heard of Narayan Maharaj? I'm like, well, I mean, I knew who he was. I know he had, performed, Prabhupada's, funeral services and all, and buried Srila Prabhupada and all, stuff. But I didn't know very much. So he gave me this book. I was like, oh, cool, thank you. He's no, put it away. So you weren't supposed to have it in the ISKCON temple. I was like, okay. And then I started to learn that there was sort of animosity that, they had this idea that some of Srila Prabhupada's god brothers would be, stealing devotees from this concept, which that wasn't really my thing to get into. So I just so I read the book, and I was just blown away, because although I had read so many of Srila Prabhupada's books, this was something, when I say more modern, I don't mean modern interpretations of things, but just his way of explaining certain things. I always tell people it sounded like a grandfather or a grandmother explaining something to a little kid. It's like he wasn't explaining things in a way, when Prabhupada first started writing and first started teaching people in America, you have to remember, or in the West in general, you have to remember that he was going and teaching people who had zero background at all in anything Vedic or anything. He was coming, when he came to America, none of these people had ever met any, gurus or read anything from the Vedas, and at best, if some of them had read, some Bhagavad Gita, it was usually a Western translation, done by someone who wasn't necessarily from that tradition, so he is teaching these people things that they're hearing for the very first time, and not just practices they're hearing for the first time, but an entire culture that they knew about, had zero background. So he had a way, it works for beginners. Like when you go to the temple on Sundays, an ISKCON temple on Sundays, you're hearing things that are lectures kind of for beginners or people with no background. Now, if you're there for 5 or 6 years, every Sunday you're hearing these lectures that are meant for beginners, and so Narayan Maharaj, his books, and that's not, I'm not saying it to be derogatory. The only reason I know anything is because of the ISKCON temples, and because of the way they taught things. But his way of writing is, he was explaining things to people who already had the foundation of Bhagavad Gita and different things, people who already knew a lot of these different different texts, like Srimad Bhagavatam and things like that. So he wasn't starting from scratch. He was saying, hey, do you remember when you heard about this? Well, how about if you looked at it from this angle and saw the full picture? Or, hey, do you remember you heard about this guy? Well, the rest of his family was doing this while this was happening in Bhagavad Gita, and this, so it was this huge thing to me, because it was like all of a sudden, I didn't just have Star Wars anymore. I had all these other movies now. I had all these other texts and all these other kind of angles and other stories about these personalities to learn from, and I couldn't get enough of it. So I had that same devotee. I asked him for another book, and he gave me another one. And then there was this huge kind of war broke out in the Brooklyn Temple, and the devotee who ran they had a Prabhupada museum on one of the floors there with all kinds of Prabhupada artifacts and things of his and stuff. He decided he was moving out of the temple with his family, and he was moving the museum out of there and all, and because they were on him for following Narayan Maharaj, and they didn't like that. So he would set up a table outside across the street from the Brooklyn Temple every Sunday, selling Narayan Maharaj's books and things like that, when they would have the ISKCON programs across the street. He's like, they can stop me from doing it in the temple, but they can't stop me from over here, and he was great. He was he was a devotee. He was a Prabhupada disciple named Puru, and he was kind of wild. He was like a New York cab driver, like total stereotype, and it was awesome. He but to his benefit, or to everyone else's benefit too, he was never trying to draw people to himself. He's like, hey, you want to understand Prabhupada's books that you're reading there a little more? Here, take this. And so it was actually kind of, if they would have seen it for what it was, it would have been beneficial to them. But so either way, he was doing that, and then one day he tells me, hey, Narayan Maharaj is actually coming to America. And I'm like, oh, I've got to go see him. I got to hear him for myself. So Maharaj came to America. I went to hear him speak, and that first day that I met him, it reiterated that whole thing, that I'd said about, like a grandfather or grandmother. And I say grandmother, not because he was, like feminine in any way, but it was just that same kind of weird, like warmth and like kind of familiarity of someone teaching you something because it's for your benefit and because, they're that close. There was this kind of intimate thing. And, having never met Prabhupada or anything, of course, because I was young, some of the other devotees, who were older were saying, see, this is what it was like when we were with Prabhupada. It was like we were getting it directly from the source, and it wasn't, filtered down through anyone else. And it just blew me away. So at that point, anytime he was coming to America or anywhere he was going, I had to go, and then, so I started writing him letters, and he always wrote back right away. And then finally one day, he told me he was coming, and he was going to be coming to Virginia, and that I could take initiation there if I wanted to. Of course, so pack up the car and let's go. So, and it was funny because when I got there were quite a few ISKCON devotees, older ISKCON devotees, who were just kind of like, we're here, but let's just kind of keep that to ourselves, because it wasn't their fault that, some of the higher ups had some issues, but it was just good to see because, they were the ones who I had learned from early on. So to see that they were going to him also to hear him speak, and that just kind of backed up what I started to think about him. And he was not, I mean, I know, of course, it's the nature of this whole thing that everyone says about their guru, no, he wasn't a regular person. He wasn't, you know what I mean? But just the way he spoke and the way he taught, I had never experienced that in any field, in anything.
Right. Yeah.
And it was just like, it was just such an intimate thing. Like, hey, I'm not your teacher. I am not your guru. I'm not, any kind of, I'm not your spiritual master. He's like, I'm your friend, and I have this bunch of stuff that I want to give to you because I love it so much, and that was always the thing. Like he, even a reporter asking him, like, oh, at the airport, like, oh, all your followers, all your disciples are here to see you. And he said, I don't have disciples. These are my friends.
Right.
And he was just really like that, Wow. So it was a big thing, and I remember, asking him little things like, oh, should I live in the temple? Should I do this? Should I do that? And he's like, he never pushed anything like that. His thing was always, you're learning to do these things in your life. You're not learning to take on a different life or someone else's life or someone else's practices. That's not real. If it's not you and it's not you really doing it, then
We've talked about we've mentioned obviously John Joseph and Gnostic Front, etc. So your YouTube channel was amazing. There's so much
all over the place.
So I've been watching a very young you jumping around on stage. So can you take us, what was your first band? Was it Son of Eve?
Oh no, that was actually a friend's band who I played drums for, and sometimes I would sing for, But that was actually like a friend's rap group.
Yeah, because there was a real crossover there from what like almost kind of like a biohazard type, Rage Against the Machine kind of stuff.
Yeah. And the guitar player was my brother-in-law, actually, he's been in a number of bands like Sheer Terror and bands like that, and like Kill Your Idols. And but my first band was actually called Kulturkampf.
Right.
And I was when I was about 15, 16, and our first demo was called As It Is, named after Bhagavad Gita, and we would literally just take lyrics from Bhagavad Gita, and half of which I in retrospect, it's like, what on earth was I even saying? Like, I'm just like rambling these things, but it was an attempt to try to kind of share what I was getting into, and then after that, my band was Muddfoot, which was probably the the band I was in the longest, and we got to do play a lot of shows and tour everywhere and stuff. And of course, it was always singing Krishna conscious lyrics, and then and it's funny, during that time, you talk about seeing certain people at the temple, that in the early 90s, probably like 90 or so, 89, 90, see like the Today guys at the temple. And at the time, I was such a jerk because I'm like, well, this temple, like Raghunath would have people in the temple with him, like this whole kind of gang around him and all. And at the time, I was just like, I didn't come from this. I came from George Harrison. Obviously, I'm a kind of a step above you guys, and it was stupid because you realize later, like the service that these guys did was kind of like unparalleled. When you talk about, like I said, someone like George Harrison, say, and sometimes you have ISKCON devotees kind of get upset when you make this kind of claim, but George Harrison spread Krishna all over the world more so than any other person. And people say, well, what do you mean? Srila Prabhupada. It's like, Srila Prabhupada, okay, Srila Prabhupada definitely, brought it to the West and spread it all over the planet. But more people actually heard, Krishna's name from George Harrison than from any other person on the planet. I mean, when you think about, even like My Sweet Lord, that record, I mean, every nook and cranny on the planet, that record was everywhere, and whether you love it or hate it, you've heard it a million times, like, so, so guys like Raghunath and things that they were doing years later, you realize like, wow, these guys were really bringing this literally all over the planet. And then, and no one was like, telling them they had to or paying them to do that. They were doing that because it was something they realized was so beneficial to them that they wanted to, give it to everyone else who would have it, So I got over it a little bit after a while,
Because what really kind of fascinates me as well is that you look at stuff like Shelter, you look at One, you've got that hardcore background there, and even like the Sheer Terror and the old school skinhead stuff, and the DMS crew and but it's great to hear like a Smithers Jones, Muddfoot playing jam number.
Yeah.
And I know that you've posted stuff about Kula Shaker, but just going come back to that kind of like you seem a kind of a hardcore skin stroke mod stroke Krishna devotee.
Yeah.
That was just fantastic. And can you talk a little bit more about that? Were you
okay? So
jam? Did you love the jam as well?
Well, when I had that band Muddfoot, right? I had a lot of interest in, the early '60s mod bands. I mean, like the Small Faces was like my favorite band at the time, and things like that. And so, of course, I loved, Weller and the Jam and everything, And after a while, Muddfoot was 8 years or so, was going for about 8 years or so, and I really wanted to do, other kinds of music that I liked, not exclusively, not instead of, but after a while, I started a band called The Charade, which was just a straight kind of mod / power pop band. And because for me, there was always a fine line between, skinhead and mod, it was, there was never much different to me, you know what I mean? It's like, my love of reggae and stuff like that came, and like, early soul and stuff like that came before, punk rock. And, my parents were, Motown and Tamla and Stax freaks, when I was a kid. So, I always had that in my ear first, and of course, the skinhead thing with so much reggae, it was an easy kind of transition. It's like, I still wore the same shirts, I just let my hair grow a little longer, And so the very last thing Muddfoot did, we were doing this it was a jam tribute that some record label was doing. So they were collecting all these different East Coast bands to do covers of jam songs. So we purposely picked one that Bruce Foxton sang actually instead of Weller, just because we knew all the other bands would be doing, you know, some of the more popular Weller songs. So that's why we wound up with Smithers Jones. But so then I started that band, The Charade, and you know, kept playing shows. And it's funny, we used to have Baby Gopal play shows with us,
Right.
because although they were part of that whole scene, they really weren't a hardcore band, you know, musically, you know. So there were always these kind of mod pop nights in New York. So we'd have them play shows with us, you know. And you know, technically, if you listen to Shelter, I never really thought of Shelter as like a hardcore band either, and musically, you know. I mean, Youth Today, of course, but Shelter musically, not really. That's why, you know, 108 was like my thing, especially, you know, back then, because, you know, 108 was as loud as we needed them to be, you know what I mean? Yeah, so with the mod band, it kind of, like you said, it started to come like, you know, full circle, you know, with the 60s thing. And you know, and we would even do a couple of George Harrison songs here and there. And but I never, like I said, I never saw it as much of I didn't really see it as like straying too much from like the Skinhead, when the punk rock thing. It's like we're still singing about whatever it is we want to sing about. And you know, I was still wearing the same clothes, you know. And nowadays, you know, like Doc Martin makes vegan docs and stuff like that. Back then, you know, they had to kind of get around it by wearing other things and stuff, you know. But I never saw much separation between, like I said, skinhead and mod. And you know, and it's a strange thing, because in New York, the skinhead thing was a little different. Like, I mean, you know, hardcore wasn't, to me, it wasn't what I thought of as skinhead music. You know, to me, that was always kind of more like, you know, reggae and pub rock and things like that, you know. So you always had this kind of weird, you know, just because you have a bunch of guys in Fred Perry's and shaved heads, you know what I mean, that, you know, they weren't really, you know, necessarily doing what I would call, you know, skinhead music. And even guys like, you know, like Jimmy from Murphy's Law would even explain too, like we don't even say oi, we say yo, because that's not what we say, you know. And so there was always this kind of open kind of crossover and, you know, idea, you know. And also, you know, with the mod band, it didn't seem as weird singing some of the more, you know, direct kind of Vaishnav songs. And for a while, we had a sitar player also that played, you know, and that just made it seem more of like a 60s kind of psychedelic thing, and no one really thought twice about it, you know.
That's really interesting. I really like that. So it felt more kind of natural, so to speak, or not, you know, to play this stuff in a kind of a mod kind of soul kind of reggae style than
Sure. Because I mean, you know, if you had, you know, like I said, if you hear some song from like 1967, and then all of a sudden some sitar kicks in, it's like, oh yeah, that just sounds like 1967. It just sounds like, you know, it didn't seem, you know, like they were bringing in some foreign thing, you know. It was just like, oh yeah, that's just what they did then, you know. So doing that, and especially in the 90s, there was this big kind of, I don't want to say like, you know, you can't really say modern revival when it comes to like America, but I should say there was a big renewed interest in that sort of thing, you know, like you know, freak beat and mod stuff and everything. So it was easy to just, you know, play shows and bring our sitar player around, and, you know.
Great. Madhu, would you like to
say something?
Yeah, there's our next question.
Yeah, I think, yeah, okay. Sundarananda, Prabhu, there are some pictures of Muddfoot, and you have very short hair, and you are wearing tulasi neckbands.
Sure.
That's kind of difference. Like, for example, with 108 or Shelter, that at least in the beginning they use it to to distribute prasad, for example, or playing with dhoti, kurta, it's kind of different. So you were doing something like that also sometimes, or
Yeah. Sometimes I would wear like a kurta or something, you know what I mean. But I would always have my beads on, of course, and like always had. And sometimes I had the sika like early on, you
yeah,
know. But it was a strange thing. Like when I was living in the temple, they would I was still in the band. I was in Mudfoot, and they would pick me up to go play shows. They would bring clothes,
yeah,
because I'd be in the temple and Kurta and Dodi and stuff, and they would come pick me up. It's like, all right, we're playing 4 shows this weekend, so they would come pick me up on Thursday, bring me clothes, and we'd go and play our shows. And then Sunday night, Monday morning, they'd drop me off back at the temple with just my Kurta and Dodi and stuff. So I mean, sometimes I would play with a Dodi on or Kurta on, but I also I had this whole thing of I wanted people to hear what I was saying, and of course I wanted people to be interested in it, and I didn't want to put them off as trying to say like, hey, I'm part of this thing, you should listen to me because I'm a part of this thing. And I always wanted it to be like, hey, we're all the same. Like, and I got this thing that I wanted to tell you about. You got something you wanted to tell me about. I got something. So not playing shows all the time in in a Dodi and stuff like that kind of helped with that.
yeah,
Um, because like I said, it would just put you on the same level with everyone else. And that was I always said that was important. Um, and like even when we would play, we would play certain shows where we would have, say, devotees come and with the book table in there, and we'd have like prasadam before the show or something, and even at that time, I never wanted to present it as some big foreign, religious thing that I'm trying, because I was never, conversion was never pushed on me. Like, you don't have to convert to
yeah,
anything. You know what I mean? So I never wanted to have anybody else think that was kind of the goal that we were coming with, um, because I always thought that all this stuff was beneficial to people. So I never, and it's funny because even some of like the some of the more, we play a lot of skinhead shows and stuff like that, obviously, and here especially in No Resistance here, that was a big thing. Was we would play a lot of shows before big games like the big football, the soccer games. Um, so it's funny, our team here, our local team here in Houston, the colors are orange. You know, so I mean, my whole thing was like, well, let me see. Shaved, a bunch of guys with shaved heads wearing orange chanting together on Sundays, like that's not weird at all. Like that's what we do. You know what I mean? So,
yeah.
so it was so easy to kind of like explain this to a lot of the skinhead guys, and it was so strange that so many people were so much more open to it than you'd think. It's just like, you know, and I think that's because, especially in America, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's been such a, I don't want to say this without being too offensive to people, such a weird kind of oppressive push from kind of like right-wing Christianity, and with that goes a lot of things that I find distasteful. Not necessarily the religion part of it, but the kinds of people who push those things, and the groups that they form to kind of push those things were always like distasteful. So I always felt like there was going to be this kind of pushback or resentment if you were singing anything, religious or anything. And surprisingly, there just wasn't. And it's almost like people were more open to it because it wasn't that. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, so you're trying to tell me about something. You're not trying to get me to, vote for some, Republican candidate and go to your church and, profess this, that, and the other things. Like, I think because it wasn't that, that made people even more open to it and more accepting of it even.
Like proselytism, it doesn't fit much. Proselytism.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
like facilities thing. Like, sometimes it's as you say, like better to be natural and to preach with the example instead of like everything that you say is like people feeling like I don't know, like they want to end the conversation with you early. It's
oh
not
yeah,
like you don't inspire something. You just push something, and that's not good. You know,
yeah, yeah.
so
And like,
you see it everywhere. Yeah.
one of the things I try to tell people a lot, um, is that in the same way that I tell people about, where it's like I'm not a doctor, I'm a nutritionist. I can only tell you what's worked for me, and I can only give you, the ideas that have worked for me, or that I've found to be, beneficial. I can't, like, why, I mean, so a lot of these guys, a lot of the people that you'd meet at a lot of shows, we would always have, particularly before, like, one of the big, they always have like a base together, and so we always have, like, vegan chili, and we always have like all this like different stuff, and when people realized it wasn't gross, it tastes like the earth. I'm like, well, there's no dirt in it. It's food still, know. You know, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's all right. It's like, yeah, yeah. And you kind of edge your way in with things like that, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, maybe the rest of this guy's ideas aren't so crazy either, because he fed us something that didn't taste like, a bunch of, grass and dirt, um, and so, the whole Vaishnava philosophy, even from the beginning, and even Prabhupada used to say all the time, it's all about chanting, dancing, and feasting. Those are always the big things that, Prabhupada explained, like, that's what we are, that's what we do. So, I mean, that's kind of easy to share with people, you know what I mean? Like I said, it's a sonic theology, so when you're, so many of the realizations, or so much of what you learn comes through, singing, or hearing music, or, um, so I always thought that, hey, it's a great thing to be able to work into whatever kind of music, you're playing, or whatever, because people like music, and, music is kind of a universal way to communicate, so, and if you're doing so in a way, like I said, that's not, preachy, you're coming from some platform that better, so you're trying to help out the little guy, like, then it's a lot easier for people to be open to it, and,
Yeah.
um like it's funny, nowadays, or even like no resistance shows, you go play shows, and you got a bunch of skinheads in the crowd yelling Hare Krishna at the stage. That's like, and I laugh about it even still now, because I'm like, it's like the funniest thing in the world. You gotta, who would have thought that this could happen? But because to them, that's a way of showing kind of like kinship, with us, and it's just like, yeah, hey, we're with you, you're all right, you know what I mean? And like, that's amazing to me. I mean, there's sometimes people would ask, like, well, isn't all of that kind of, that whole like religious thing, the whole, Hare Krishna thing, Vaishnava thing, isn't that like, how can you, be a skinhead and also be that? I'm like, well, there's not an also, there's really nothing, there's no clash there. I mean, like, okay, so, I go to work every day, I go to my job every day, I do my duty, of course, um, that kind of falls under both. That's kind of what I'm supposed to do. You know what I mean? I don't, and like, there's no real clash. Like, there's no one saying, hey, there's no rule book that says, like, oh, well, in order to be a skinhead, you're supposed to wear these leather boots, and you've got to, what I mean? You've got to eat this specific kind of food. Like, you just eat food. What do you mean? You just, like, none of it, like I said, none of it had anything to do with the other. You know what I mean? So there was never any kind of clash. It's just that, a lot of people realize that you can use one to kind of spread the word about the other.
That's some, that's something that sorry. That's something that makes it so special that usually we see the Krishnacore scene, like many people is coming from the Strayed sign with a Strayed background, but when someone comes with a skinhead background, it's something so special like Chromax, for example, also Antidote, or also
Yeah.
this the what is it, Giantadas from Warzone, from
Yeah, yeah.
Agnostic Front, or
Well,
Tarun
yeah, yeah.
Krishna. For Tarun Krishna, he also used to live in the street, like a long time,
Yeah.
and that was his life. So everything is special, but for me, like the skinhead thing is that because at least with the striations, you have some kind of the principles like no eating animals, no
Yeah.
drinking, no drugs. Sometimes they take like the no promiscuity, but
Yeah.
I mean some striations, but with the skinhead is something different, not drinking beer, having some fun, listening reggae. There's
Well, you know what's funny? In the early New York hardcore days, right? Like there was no real distinction between like there weren't like skinheads and straight edge guys.
yeah,
Like straight edge guys were just a type of skinhead. You know what I mean? Like in like especially like the early and mid '80s, there was certain straight edge bands like say like Side by, you know what I mean? They were an old New York hardcore band, straight edge band, Side by Side and bands like that, or even like well, so even like Antidote, guys like that, and you know there were straight edge bands who those guys were skinheads. They just didn't drink and didn't do drugs and didn't smoke. So it wasn't like they were a separate thing. It was kind of like
yeah,
later in the '80s when like the straight edge bands started to kind of grow like the bleach blonde flat tops, with like sports gear and stuff like that. That it became two separate things. But early on, it's just that there were certain skinheads who were into straight edge. There are certain ones who were I don't know, into there was even like anarchy guys, so skinheads coming from like punk rock. In my mind, it was like, okay, well, I love like semi crass and my conflict and stuff over here, and then there's the white bands over here. But in New York, there really wasn't that kind of separation. It was a strange thing. Like different kinds of politics didn't necessarily uh, divide up into different subcultures. Like just some skinheads were into this, some were into that. So not drinking or anything like that. You could be straight edge and be a skinhead, but you weren't a straight edge kid. You know what I mean? That was a
yeah.
separate kind of subculture that kind of grew out a
Like a
little later
sect,
on.
like a sect.
So early on, like yeah. So like even early on, going to like early BT Today shows and stuff like that. It's like those guys are in Fred Perry's and like punk rock shirts and stuff. Those to me those were skinheads. They had shaved heads and they were just they were skinheads. It wasn't like a separate thing at that time.
Yeah,
So it didn't seem as odd back then. And one of the things that you talk about, say like John Joseph say. There used to be every weekend, and he still does it now. I mean, COVID, of course, kind of put the kibosh on a lot of things, but you would always see in Tompkins Square Park people giving out food to the homeless every week, and no matter, it was always the Cro-Mags guys, always, and it was like, say what you want, people can say what they want and stuff, but these guys are out here in the rain giving food to homeless people, and they're not doing it for cameras. They're not doing it, because anyone's, paying them to do it or anyone's telling them to. It's just, they're doing it because that's what they do,
yeah,
so it was really commendable. I remember going to one temple. There was a temple on, it was on First and A. First, yeah. And the guru there was a Prabhupada disciple, and he had kind of broken away from ISKCON and he was into, you know what Ritvic philosophy is?
Yeah.
Ritvic, you know what that is, right? Okay, so they don't necessarily believe that you have to have a living guru. They, to them, guru, and they can initiate you as a disciple of Prabhupada.
Prabhupada.
And I don't feel like I've just never subscribed to that myself, but they because like you said, the idea for us is you have to have a living guru, living acharya to show you like kind of. But they had this little temple, and it was great, and they were doing this food for the homeless like several times a week, and they had just really nice little program. Just started going there, just to kind of support them a little bit, and then one day I'm thinking about it. I'm like, where did they even get them this temple? Like, how did they even do this? The guru there, his name was, I'll remember his name. But there was a devotee there that lived there named Brahma Bhutta, and he's still around. But it eventually got to me that Joseph had actually paid for everything and actually set them up, but he didn't want anybody to know. He was keeping it kind of, just kind of. I'm like, people can say what they want about like hardcore guys and punk rock and skinhead and all this, but this is the kind of stuff these guys are doing. You know what I mean? Like, just kind of without telling anybody. You're not doing it for any kind of glory. They're just doing it because it just needed to be done, and they thought it was a good idea. So all those things always stuck with me. It's like, you know what? Like, there's no, like I said, there's no rule book that says like, oh well, if you're a skinhead, you need to be at the pub this many days a week. You need to be drinking beer. You need to be. It's like, what does that have? That doesn't really have anything to do with anything. What I mean? That's like and it's just and it's always been there. You know what I mean? So it's they don't. No one kind of sets the rules for those things. You know what I mean? And like you said, like even from the early days of Agnostic Front, so you always saw like devotees involved with like skinhead bands and hardcore bands and stuff. So it's kind of strange that anybody would think it was strange.
Yeah. I also sorry. I was talking with one skinhead guy here from Prague in Czech Republic, and he told to me that in the 92, 93, after fall down of communism, some concerts started to going on, and Charter was one of the first bands who came to Prague in that time, and the Hare Krishnas always were doing kirtan before the show, and also came the skinheads, the striates, and all of them were together because of the Hare Krishnas. Like, so somehow it's Hare Krishna it has also like a punk attitude, no? Like Prabhupada, Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj came with almost no money, with some books, and in 11 years he did so many things, and also
all over the world.
Also Srila Narayan Maharaj, he was preaching and he defied so many misconceptions, like cutting, like so many misconceptions that Western devotees accumulated in these years, like 10, 11 years that Srila Prabhupada was present here in the Western countries. But everything it has so much value for everyone who comes to Krishna consciousness. So and in the end, everyone is so lucky to have just one moment of association with these acharyas, with these sadhus. So so anyway, thanks for sharing that, bro. It's like, for me, so special.
I mean, well, like, what you're saying about like Prague and stuff, like what's more punk rock than that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, okay, you have this band coming in and playing someplace where that wasn't allowed before, right? And what they're playing is songs about, these different, positive philosophical ideas that they're trying to share with people. And in doing so, they're bringing together, you know, different subcultures and different groups. Like, what's more punk rock than that? You know what I mean? That's fantastic.
Yeah. There is one I was speaking long time ago. I was talking with one friend, and you know this, especially these Mayavadi yogis, like they always ask, "What is the superpower of your guru?"
Yeah.
If someone asked to this devotee, and he said, "The power of my guru is that he joined people from Russia, from United States, from communist countries, from capitalist countries, all of them in chanting Hare Krishna and chanting the holy names. And that's the power of the holy names. That's the power of my guru.
Yeah.
Everything that the material world separates by political things, by religious things, by I don't know, uh, Prabhupada and Krishna consciousness is make it all together. Like just chant Hare Krishna and be happy, be in peace, and chant Hare Krishna, learn the philosophy, and listen Harikatha, and take prasadam, and this. In the end, you had everything. You know, you have everything.
That's it.
So,
Yeah.
thank you, bro.
That's fantastic.
Mike.
I think well, I've, we've got some questions, but you've kind of answered them, including, you know, like sort of tensions in the scene between religion and hardcore scene, etc., etc. If I could just ask you one last question,
Sure, of course.
why soccer? And why Houston Dynamos? And why Manchester United? That's three questions, isn't it? Yeah, that's three.
Am I supposed to say play on Pompeii and just like shut off like
And I also checked where you are in the league.
yeah.
Should we not kind of talk about that? Should we kind of skip that?
No, because then I'll start getting to all these weird things about City and all that, you know, but you know, much like you know, in America, you know, when I was a kid, we had and we're the same age, so you'll be able to see what I'm coming from. The in America, we had no, in New York, I should say, we had the Cosmos. Okay, they were this soccer team. There were literally 6 or 7 other teams in the entire league.
Yeah.
You know, so when you'd go see them play, it was against one of these, you know, one of these few teams. You know, and they had Pele. That was like the big attraction. Like, you know, you're really going to see Pele and a bunch of like American guys who are just kind of running in circles around him on this terrible garbage dump pitch that it wasn't even like, you know, playable. So a lot of us, who, if you liked that sport, you got into and you know, with that sport, it wasn't like say American football. We've got to buy all this kind of gear to play and all this, you know, all this equipment to play and all this. No, you have the ball and a bunch of guys and you're good. You know what I mean? You're ready to go. So if you liked the sport back then in America, you really had to look outside of America to kind of, you know, follow any teams or follow the game at all, because there was no one, you know, and once that first league and the Cosmos and everything kind of fell apart, it was years and years before, you know, football picked up again in America, and it wasn't until there were teams like the first of the MLS teams that it really started to pick up in America again. And at that point in New York, we had the Red Bulls, and they were this New Jersey. They weren't the New York Red Bulls. To me, they were a New Jersey team. And when you're from New York and there's something from New Jersey, you just reject it just because of that. You know, it's kind of like, you know, so but also at the same time, I had moved to Texas, to Houston, and we had just gotten a new team, the Houston Dynamo. And they were brand new, so they're like, oh, we can actually go to these games here locally, you know. So of course, you know, you're gonna go to the games, you're gonna support them, you know. And then they wound up doing great in the first couple of years. I mean, they won the MLS Cup twice in a row, and they, you know, so so they kind of because it was local and because you know you can go locally, that's, you know, you support your local team. Now the Manchester thing, like I said, was when I was younger, you know, you didn't have much to choose from in America. You know, like there weren't really like, you know, these American teams. So you start watching like, you know, EPL, and back then, you know, of course there wasn't like cable like we have it now, you know, so you weren't seeing like, you know, you weren't seeing League One or any of these other, you know, you weren't seeing any of that, you know, so you're literally just seeing kind of like the top you would see. And this was like right before uh the EPL, because I think that was like that started in like the late 90s. So you can only bigger teams, you know, and so back then, of course, you see Manchester United all the time, you know, and because like anyone involved in any kind of subculture, you know, whether it be, you know, skinhead, punk rock, any of that, of course, you gravitate towards certain things because of your musical influences, you know, like it was funny. I think you'll find like a lot of like American skinheads who are, you know, in their 40s or early 50s, they all became like West Ham supporters.
Yeah.
And or like Chelsea support, and that was because of the bands that they were listening to. You know what I mean? They're singing, you know, whether it was like, you know, The Business or whoever, like that's, you know, that's who they're listening to, and that's what they're singing about. It's like, oh, you know, that's what they gravitated towards, you know. And you know, because of my whole interest in you know, in a lot of the mod stuff, which later, like, you know, in the late 80s and stuff, early 90s, translated into like say Stone Roses, like what, you know, which is one of my big obsessions. That for whatever reason I've always been like an Ian Brown like obsessive, you know, and so that kind of tied into my interest in checking out Manchester United, you know. And then when you started to find out why there were so many people who were kind of not into Manchester United because they equated them with like they thought of them in the way that we kind of think of like the Yankees and American like baseball here, you know what I mean? Like this kind of privileged team that, like, you know, had all the money and had all this, you know, but at that point I was already invested, so I stuck with it, you know what I mean? And I never got into I never got into, I mean, although I'll watch, of course, World Cup, right?
Yeah.
But you know, in America, say MLS, the American teams are always made up of MLS players. So when we're so, you know, we spend the entire year at Dynamo games kind of cursing these guys out and yelling at these guys. All of a sudden, like, you know, every 4 years I'm supposed to like cheer these same guys on and like back them, you know. So I was never able to get into that like world wise, you know.
Yeah.
And then with Inter, like Inter Milan, a lot of my family were Inter Milan fans. So that always made me watch too. And then, you know, every year, a lot of the bigger teams will come and tour in America. Like in the summer, they'll do like a, you know, Manchester will do a summer tour, or, you know, Inter Milan will do a summer tour and play in a bunch of places. So we'd always travel around and follow them around. And early on, it was catch like Inter Milan versus Manchester City. So I got to get into some of my kind of Manchester City kind of feelings through Inter, you know. So
yeah. No, that's great.
And it's just, you know, and it's funny too with the, you know, with the skinhead thing, because in, like I said, in America, you find so many of these guys, it's almost like you can figure out what someone's personal philosophy is by which team they say they support. You know what I mean? And like, you know, you have some guys who they decide they're into, like, say Chelsea. And immediately I'm like raising an eyebrow. I'm like, what are you, like some Combat 84 guy or something? Like, what, you know, where did you get that from? Like, what made you, you know what I mean? Like, what made you gravitate towards that? And that's, you know, immediately you start to put in kind of boxes based on that, you know.
Crazy, isn't it? It's great it was great to see you supporting Houston Dynamo, and for me to think, hang on, so where are they? They're actually in the league, and then looking at, because Beckham went over to Galaxy, didn't he? And thinking,
well, yeah, Dynamo is actually terrible right now. The last couple of years they've been just horrible, and so now they've just done this whole like rebranding that I think they think is going to kind of change everything. So now it's Houston Dynamo FC, you know what I mean? They've got like new logo and everything, and they, you know, we've got a whole bunch of new blood in there and like a new manager and all. So we'll see what happens. The season starts in April, and that's another thing too. There's only a little bit of crossover between like the European season and the season here, so we get to have football all year, kind of,
Yeah, so I think I might start following them.
It's interesting. I mean, at first they played at the University of Houston stadium here, and so we started to hold rallies, which is funny because we had these big rallies all the time outside like the mayor's office, where we'd have like Prashadam and stuff too, which is, talk about crossovers, the most ridiculous thing. But yeah, I remember it was funny too, like handing out like pakoras and like little flags, little orange flags, everybody, but we had these rallies to try to get a stadium built. So then finally, they capitulated and they built us a stadium, and so we have our own, the supporters group. We have the Brick Wall Firm is one of the supporters groups, and we have our own section in the stadium, where they let us, basically do whatever we want. And if you look at the first No Resistance 7-inch,
yeah,
there's a picture of a game, one of the first games at the old stadium, and if you look at the bottom in orange, it says Hare Krishna on the wall in the supporter section. Yeah, I used to sneak those things in under the radar. That was your first starting to sneak things in under the radar. But then we got our stadium, and then they started doing really well. Like I said, 2 cups, and we would there are a couple of times we were banned from the stadium for just being supporters. Which is crazy. You light off a couple of smoke bombs, and all of a sudden you're the enemy, and you're not allowed to come to the stadium. But then they would use footage of those same smoke bomb explosions in their advertisements on TV, trying to get people to come to the games. And it's like, wait a minute, but it's it's all fun stuff, and it contributes to such a family atmosphere, and just kind of getting everybody together every week, and we'd all eat together before the games, and it's just good stuff.
Right.
And like I said, a lot of the shows here would be based around that too. Like we would have we would bring in bands from everywhere to play. We would have a show on Saturday afternoon, and then that night would be the game, or we'd have the game that afternoon and the show that night, all based around the same, advertising for both, at both,
Now I don't know if you can hear this in the background, but my wife is calling me because my tea is ready. My dinner, my veggie roast dinner. So
it's late now, right? Was it 7:30 over there?
Yeah, it's 7:30, and it's 8:30 where Madhu is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's even later for him. Okay. Probably past his bedtime, being a devotee, and having to get up at 4:00. So the last hour and a half talking to you has been absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Oh, I've really enjoyed it. I'm so glad.
It's just been great. And
I can't wait to see what you wind up with.
Yeah,
I can't wait to see what you wind up with, because just having someone put it all together is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, hopefully we can both kind of do it justice. And it's lovely to have Madhu, because Madhu will the last thing I want to do is cause any kind of offence in writing about this stuff. And it's great because Madhu's kind of an insider to it, and he can make sure that I don't cause anyone offence. But Madhu's knowledge of this, I mean, he's the world expert on it. He's just fantastic. It's brilliant.
That's awesome.
Okay.
But
Mike, you want to say something?
Yeah. Would you like? Madhu? Would you be able to draw this to a close?
Sorry.
Would you be able to end the meeting, draw it to a close?
So Sundarananda, was really nice to have this meeting with you. We never saw each other before, even in the virtual reality, we never spoke, I think. But really nice to hear about all your experience in the bands. But for me, it touched me especially because you have a connection with my Parangurudev, Bhaktivedanta Narayan Goswami Maharaj, and I think Mike he also enjoys so much this conversation. Yeah, I think that's all for today. Yeah,
So,
and
thanks.
let's see the next chapter. I think it will be with Murari Chaitanya Das from Serbia, ex-Yugoslavia.
Good stuff.
So that's thank you, Prabhu Sundarananda.
You know, if there's anyone I can help get you in touch with, or kind of hook you up with, also, like, just say the word. I can try to help. However I.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Whether
Thank you so
I don't know if you who you plan to talk to or not, but I can kind of pull some people out of the clouds.
Please. Yeah. Right.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.